No major corporation, no matter how powerful it is, would even consider operating in a society without an army of lawyers. So there's no reason why organizations of people with disabilities should do any less. One of the wonderful things about young people, even young lawyers and law students, is that they, I think, have a natural capacity both for compassion and for advocacy. And so they start advocating for people with disabilities, and then they get it. They see the issues, and they see very often that the problem is not a limitation in the person with the disability. The problem is the obstacles that society places in their way. Question of how any at-risk group, whether it's a racial minority or it's a gender issue or it's people with disabilities, obtain access to legal services, is going to differ from society to society, from geographical area to geographical area. But there are some fundamentals that tend to move things along. Again, all right, based on our experience at Disability Rights Advocates, we find that if you can set up a nonprofit legal advocacy center or centers, that is of extraordinary importance because of the problem that you raise of disability groups not having lawyers. So years ago, when my wife and I spent a year on a Fulbright in Hungary, and we did a study of people with disabilities in the aftermath of the wall falling, we wrote a report, and one of our fundamental proposals was the establishment of a nonprofit disability advocacy center. And that for a while was funded by George Soros and the Open Society Institute, and I think had an impact. Another way to go, it's not exclusive, it's just an alternative, all right, is to start at the law schools. The law schools, aside from the fact that almost every law school tends to be dominated by a business corporate orientation, with most of its graduates going into the business community, all right. The area of disability is a relatively new one in the hierarchy of civil rights issues. And so disability law tends not to be taught in the law school, and if you don't teach disability law, the students don't learn it, and then you don't have lawyers. So a start is having courses that are specifically dedicated to teaching the rights of people with disabilities, both in the country and worldwide. Okay. An outgrowth of that, or sometimes an option, is a legal clinic, and I'm talking about a disability legal clinic. I taught one for a while at the University of California, and it has a number of advantages, including the fact that students like the clinical orientation. The idea of a clinic is you actually work on real cases, or you should be working on real cases. And that's exciting to students, and so I found that the clinical programs tended to attract students who might not otherwise at all be interested in disability. There are some givens to what makes a disability law clinic work or not work that we've found out from experience. So one of those is that you really need to have someone who runs the clinic, actually be a litigator and a practicing lawyer. Right. So if you have a clinic and it's run by an existing member of the faculty, I mean, academia is important and essential, and we have to teach people to think. But to lead to action, a clinic needs to be a practitioner. And so often when you set up a clinic, what you should do is not so much recruit somebody from the faculty, but recruit somebody from outside to run that clinic. So those tend to be very efficient. Those firms find it pays for them to work with us. I don't mean pay in terms of money, but it's a good press, it's good public relations, it helps them recruit young law students, and so that tends to work pretty well. One of them is, for many of them, it's the first time they actually come into contact in a personal way with somebody with a disability. And it's an eye-opener for them. I mean, in terms of both the enormous human potential for people with disabilities, which they may have given no thought to previously, as well as the societal obstacles that they face. And one of the wonderful things about young people, even young lawyers and law students, is that they, I think, have a natural capacity both for compassion and for advocacy. And so they start advocating for people with disabilities, and then they get it. They see the issues, and they see very often that the problem is not a limitation in the person with the disability. The problem is the obstacles that society places in their way. The answer is that law schools have come to recognize that a clinical program can be just as intellectually challenging, just as much of a learning experience, even just as much of what one would call an academic experience as a traditional lecture or seminar. So the clinics tend to be set up by the law school, in the law school, with the approval of the faculty. In fact, that's really the only way to, or at least it's the best way to make them fully effective. And then the students receive academic credit just as they would for any other course, depending on how much time they've put in and how much the faculty decides to give it academic credit. But they get full credit for it. There is an alternative, which is that a number of years ago with disability rights advocates, we had some students from the University of California at Berkeley who were placed with us in our law office and supervised by us and worked on our cases and received academic credit for it. But that tends to be a secondary model. That the faculties are a little more hesitant about that because they feel they don't have enough control over the quality, but you can place a student, and whether you call it a clinical experience or not, almost every public interest law firm, not just disability rights advocates and not even disability public interest law firms, almost always have law students in the summer. We do, both in our Manhattan office and in our Berkeley, California office. And sometimes it's a little harder during the winter term because their academic demands are so great. But it's very common for students to get their feet wet as students working in a real public interest law firm. Well, it's possible for a legal clinic to be more or less independent from the law school, but that tends to not be the most used model. And the reason for it is quite simple, which is, for better or worse, the faculty of law schools want to keep control over it. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. They want to make sure that their students are just not being worked to death, but are getting a serious, high-quality educational experience. And so the model tends to be a clinic that's under the jurisdiction, as it were, of the law school. But that doesn't mean it's got to be on the campus of the law school. It can be, someplace else. Sometimes a foundation might be willing to put up the funds for it. A location for the clinic is usually not a big deal. That is, it can take place, on the existing campus of a law school, or someplace on the university, even if it's not in the law school. It could be run out of a larger legal service program, and so the space is not a problem. And what often happens is very straightforward, which is that the biggest single expense, which is the salary of the person who's teaching the clinic, right, is simply a faculty salary. So that person is a member of the faculty. They receive, an appropriate salary. The second potential area for requiring funds is if you're actually doing litigation, the costs of the litigation. And the way I handled that at Disability Rights Advocates, and before that when I ran the clinic, was we brought in co-counsel, which were major corporate firms that were willing on a pro bono basis to front the costs, and you're off and running. So it's absolutely viable. In terms of getting legal representation for people with disabilities, there's no substitute for having lawyers who themselves have a disability. All right. And that was a big problem 30 years ago, because a person with a serious disability was lucky if they were able to graduate from college, much less get into a law school, not because of their problem, but because of the problem with the colleges and the law school. All right. So we're doing much better now, as we have more students with disabilities graduating from college, and then we have more students who are going into law school. And the first wave of those tended to do what the first group of any at-risk group does when they graduate from law school, which is they go out and try to make money. All right? And you can't blame them for that. But now the next wave, in my experience, of people who want to do something meaningful with their lives. And so we are really starting to get, at Disability Rights Advocates, for example, first-rate lawyers, not lawyers with disabilities who happen to want to practice law, but first-rate lawyers who happen to be people with disabilities. And they bring a sensitivity for which there is no substitute. So Disability Rights Advocates next week is filing a lawsuit against the City of New York on having an inadequate number of APSs, audible pedestrian signals, at intersections to help people who are blind and low vision. And before I even started to do legal research on the case, I sat down with a blind lawyer who worked with us to say, what do you think of this? What do you think of this technology? How important is it? What are the problems? And, and so on. We have lawyers at Disability Rights Advocates now who graduate from absolutely top law schools, and we have had people who are blind, we have people who are blind and deaf, we have people with mobility disabilities. We even had romance in the office of one person with a disability marrying another person with a disability, and it adds a vibrancy to the legal practice to understand on a personal level what the needs are. If you have an NGO, I probably would start by seeing if you can persuade the law school to just place a student with you under the supervision of a practicing lawyer and see if you can do that and have them get academic credit for it. And then if that's a good experience, all right, then you try to get 3 students, and then you can move on to a more formal structure. All right, almost a reverse way of doing it is to start with a lawyer who is with an NGO and who practices disability law, just teaching a standard course at the law school. To get students interested and to get the faculty feeling comfortable about it. So in the early years of Disability Rights Advocates, I taught at University of California at Davis, and I taught a disability rights course. I actually didn't do it to spread the word. I did it because we had no money, and so it supplemented my salary to be a lecturer at the law school. But then you start getting students interested, you start involving other members of the faculty if they're cooperative, and it becomes a first step. It's hard to just leap into it, and I think it is a little important to be patient.